Lieutenant Mark Reynolds stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the soft red soil of the alien planet. The air was thin but breathable, the sky above a strange shade of violet that twisted the horizon into something out of a dream. The landing zone was quiet, but the hum of alien technology buzzed faintly in the distance as he moved toward the center of the clearing. The sleek black ships of the Azure Empire lined the space like a deadly forest, their dark surfaces reflecting the distant stars. The heat from the twin suns beat down on his back as he adjusted his uniform and took a deep breath. The whole planet felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. The Azure were a race that commanded fear, their empire stretching across dozens of star systems. Their warriors feared, and their technology beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. And yet here he was, a simple diplomat tasked with negotiating peace, or so the higher-ups in the Federation had hoped. The mission had been delicate, and the situation had grown more tense by the day. The Azure had always been a proud species, and the humans had taken their share of land. In recent years, disputes over territory had grown into a full-blown diplomatic crisis, and Mark was chosen for the job because he had the experience in handling the unyielding and the unknown. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the first sight of Nyxara, the queen of the Azure, took him completely by surprise. Towering and imposing with dark metallic skin that shimmered in the light, her eyes were the color of polished obsidian, cold and calculating as they fixed on him. The sheer presence of her made the air feel heavier, as if gravity itself had increased just by her standing there. She was clothed in regal armor that looked like it had been forged in the heart of a star. Her posture was perfect, a queen in every sense of the word. Mark didn't flinch as her gaze bore into him. He had faced more than his share of power in the form of corrupt politicians, warlords, and generals. But something about Nyxara was different. This wasn't just power in the traditional sense. This was ancient and raw. Her authority emanated like a tangible force pressing against his chest. Human, her voice was low and smooth like silk sliding across skin. "So you are the one they've sent to negotiate with us?" Mark stood tall, meeting her gaze without wavering. "That's right, I'm here to make sure we don't go to war." Her lips curled slightly into a smile that sent an involuntary chill through him. War is inevitable for those who think they can take what does not belong to them. "I'm not here to take anything, I'm here to offer peace," Mark said, trying to sound confident, even though the words felt strange in his mouth, as if he had no right to offer anything. Nyxara tilted her head and studied him with those cold eyes. "Peace is a fragile thing, especially when it involves the Azure." She stepped closer, and Mark's heart rate picked up slightly, though he refused to show it. "You think you can sway me with words, human? I will see how long your resolve lasts when faced with the truth of what we are." Before he could respond, Nyxara raised her hand, and the room seemed to shift, as if reality itself were bending around them. She was not just a queen, she was something more. Her presence overwhelming. The air felt heavier, the lights dimming, as if the room itself were afraid to remain in her presence. "You will stay on my ship while we speak." Nyxara's voice was like ice cutting through the thickening tension. "We will see if you still speak of peace after you understand what it means to truly face the Azure." Mark nodded slowly, though his mind was racing. He had expected this. It was always going to be a test, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about him. It was about humanity's future, the future of billions of lives, depending on what happened next. Nyxara turned without another word, and Mark followed her, stepping onto the transport that would carry him deeper into the heart of Azure space, toward the Queen's ship, toward whatever challenges awaited him there. Mark stood in the dimly lit chamber of the Azure flagship. The walls were smooth and black, with strange glowing patterns running across them like veins of light. The air was thick with a subtle hum of technology. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The ship felt alive, as though it were breathing, its dark corridors winding endlessly into unknown spaces. Nyxara had escorted him here without a word, or silent presence unnerving Mark more than he cared to admit. The feeling of being watched never leaving him. She led him into a large room at the center of the ship, the vast circular space, with a translucent floor that looked down into the depths of the ship's core. Far below, lights flickered and shifted in patterns across the floor like stars in the night sky. The walls were lined with imposing statues of Ashar warriors, their eyes glowing faintly, as if they were alive. Mark couldn't help but feel like he was standing in the heart of an empire built on power and fear, the weight of centuries of conquest pressing down on him. Nyxera took a seat on a throne-like chair at the center of the room and gestured for Mark to stand before her, her gaze unblinking and cold. She was the embodiment of authority, as if everything in the room was designed to remind him of her dominance. "You are a strange human," she said, finally breaking the silence, her voice smooth and soft like silk. "You think your words can change anything, but you are wrong." Mark swallowed but held her gaze. "I didn't come here to talk about words. I came here to show you that peace can be possible between our people." Nyxera raised an eyebrow and leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe that the Ashar do not know peace? We do not seek it. We seek power. We take what we want, and we rule without mercy." Mark clenched his jaw, but didn't flinch. "That's the thing, Nyxera. You don't have to keep fighting for power. You don't have to keep taking and conquering. You can lead without the bloodshed you're used to. It's possible to lead with strength, but without tyranny." Nyxera's eyes narrowed, and Mark could see the flicker of something in her expression, something that might have been doubt or curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, a flicker of anger. He couldn't be sure, but the change was subtle, and it was there just beneath the surface. "The weakness of your people is your blind belief in peace," she said with an almost mocking laugh. "You think that by simply talking you can change things, but the universe does not care for peace. It cares for power and survival." Mark took a step closer to her, though he knew it was a dangerous move. "We've survived because we adapt, we change. We don't just fight for survival. We fight for something more. We fight for the future of our species, and we know that we can't do it alone. We can't keep fighting forever." Nyxera studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she stood up, her height towering over him, her presence overwhelming. "You speak of survival, but your species does not understand true power. You have not seen what it means to be in control, to have the galaxy bow to your will. You are all still children in the eyes of the universe." Mark's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "Maybe we're children to you, but that doesn't mean we can't become something more. And that's what I'm offering you: peace, not surrender, not weakness, but a true alliance, one where we're equals." The Queen stepped toward him, slowly closing the space between them, her presence suffocating in its intensity. "An alliance," she whispered, as if tasting the word on her tongue. "An alliance with a race so fragile, so easily broken. You are nothing compared to us human." Mark stared into her eyes, feeling the weight of her words, but his resolve didn't waver. He had heard words like this before from enemies who underestimated humanity. He had seen what that kind of thinking led to, and he wasn't about to let it happen again, not on his watch. "Maybe so," Mark said, his voice steady, "but if there's one thing you don't understand about humanity, it's that we're not easy to break." Nyxera tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, without warning, she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, her fingers like ice against his skin. "We shall see, human, we shall see just how strong your species truly is." Her touch sent a shiver down his spine, but he refused to move or show fear. He would not let her see how much her presence affected him. He would not let her break him. "Tomorrow, Nyxera," said her voice low and dangerous, "you will face the first of many tests to prove your worth to me and to the Ashar Empire. If you fail, then this little peace you speak of will be nothing more than a dream." Mark nodded silently, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This would not be easy, but he would see it through. He would fight for humanity's future, even if it meant standing against an empire that had known nothing but conquest for millennia. The next day came quickly, and Mark was led through the winding halls of Nyxera's flagship, his mind racing with thoughts of the coming test. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Nyxera had made it clear that she saw him as nothing more than a pawn to be used or discarded, but he wouldn't let her break him. He couldn't. Humanity's future was riding on this mission, and he was determined to see it through. The room they entered was vast and cold, the walls lined with black stone, and the air heavy with the scent of something alien Mark couldn't quite place. At the center of the room was a large metallic cage. Inside it stood a creature like nothing he had ever seen before. It was tall, with 4 spindly arms and glowing red eyes. Its skin, a slick silver that shimmered unnaturally. The creature's body seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it was alive in ways that defied nature. Mark couldn't tell if it was a machine or a living being, but either way it was terrifying. Nyxera stood beside the cage, her gaze fixed on Mark. As he entered, "This is the creature you will face today," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "It is a champion of the Azhar Empire, a warrior bred for combat and survival. It will test your strength, your intellect, and your will. You will fight it in a battle to the death. And if you survive, then perhaps I will consider your words about peace." Mark swallowed hard but didn't back away. The creature's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He had faced danger before, but nothing like this, not with creatures that seemed so far beyond anything humanity had encountered. "What if I refuse to fight?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Nyxera's lips curled into a smile that was both amused and terrifying. "Refuse," she repeated softly. "Then you will die here, and your people will never know peace with the Azhar." He knew she was playing with him, trying to break his resolve, but he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Mark didn't come this far only to fail. Now he wasn't going to let his people's future slip away over some alien games. "Fine," Mark said, and took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the creature inside the cage. "Let's get this over with." Nyxera gestured, and the cage door opened with a loud hiss. The creature let out a low growl and stepped forward, its movements fluid and terrifying. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to think quickly and adapt. There was no room for hesitation here. He didn't have the luxury of second chances. The creature lunged at him with incredible speed. Mark barely had time to react, but he ducked just in time, the creature's claws slashing through the air. Where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier, Mark rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another strike. He had no weapons, no armor, just his wits, and his bare hands. He had to make this count. He glanced around the room, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His eyes landed on a long metal pipe lying in the corner. He dashed toward it, grabbing it just as the creature lunged again. This time, Mark swung the pipe with all his strength, striking the creature across its chest. The impact sent a shockwave through his body, but the creature barely flinched. It growled low and deep, its eyes glowing brighter with rage. Mark gritted his teeth and stood his ground. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to find a way to outsmart it. He had to survive. The next day came quickly, and Mark was led through the winding halls of Nyxera's flagship, his mind racing with thoughts of the coming test. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Nyxera had made it clear that she saw him as nothing more than a pawn to be used or discarded, but he wouldn't let her break him. He couldn't. Humanity's future was riding on this mission, and he was determined to see it through. The room they entered was vast and cold, the walls lined with black stone, and the air heavy with the scent of something alien Mark couldn't quite place. At the center of the room was a large metallic cage. Inside it stood a creature like nothing he had ever seen before. It was tall, with 4 spindly arms and glowing red eyes, its skin a slick silver that shimmered unnaturally. The creature's body seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it was alive in ways that defied nature. Mark couldn't tell if it was a machine or a living being, but either way it was terrifying. Nyxera stood beside the cage, her gaze fixed on Mark. As he entered, "This is the creature you will face today," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "It is a champion of the Azhar Empire, a warrior bred for combat and survival. It will test your strength, your intellect, and your will. You will fight it in a battle to the death, and if you survive, then perhaps I will consider your words about peace." Mark swallowed hard, but didn't back away. The creature's eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He had faced danger before, but nothing like this, not with creatures that seemed so far beyond anything humanity had encountered. "What if I refuse to fight?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Nyxera's lips curled into a smile that was both amused and terrifying. "Refuse," she repeated softly. Then you will die here and your people will never know peace with the Ashar." He knew she was playing with him, trying to break his resolve, but he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Mark didn't come this far only to fail now. He wasn't going to let his people's future slip away over some alien games. "Fine," Mark said, and took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the creature inside the cage. "Let's get this over with." Nixera gestured, and the cage door opened with a loud hiss. The creature let out a low growl and stepped forward, its movements fluid and terrifying. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had to think quickly and adapt. There was no room for hesitation here. He didn't have the luxury of second chances. The creature lunged at him with incredible speed. Mark barely had time to react, but he ducked just in time, the creature's claws slashing through the air. Where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier, Mark rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding another strike. He had no weapons, no armor, just his wits, and his bare hands. He had to make this count. He glanced around the room, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. His eyes landed on a long metal pipe lying in the corner. He dashed toward it, grabbing it just as the creature lunged again. This time, Mark swung the pipe with all his strength, striking the creature across its chest. The impact sent a shockwave through his body, but the creature barely flinched. It growled low and deep, its eyes glowing brighter with rage. Mark gritted his teeth and stood his ground. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to find a way to outsmart it. He had to survive. The creature charged again, and this time Mark didn't wait. He dropped low at the last second and swung the pipe upward, catching the creature under its chin. It stumbled backward for a moment, and that was all the opening Mark needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the creature by its arm and twisting it behind its back. In a move he'd learned from years of hand-to-hand combat training, the creature let out a screech of pain as Mark applied pressure, forcing it to the ground. It was now or never. Mark knew that if he didn't end it here, the creature would tear him apart. He took a deep breath, and with one final surge of strength, slammed the creature's head into the floor. The impact was brutal, and the creature went limp, its body going still. The room was silent except for the sound of Mark's ragged breathing. He stood over the creature's body, sweat dripping down his face, as he looked up at Nixera. She was watching him with a look of cold curiosity, her eyes never leaving him. "Well done, human," she said finally, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have survived your first test, but remember, this was only the beginning." Mark stood tall despite the pain in his muscles and the adrenaline still rushing through his veins. "I didn't come here to survive tests, Nixera. I came here to make peace, and I'm not going to stop just because you throw some monsters in my way." Nixera regarded him silently for a moment before nodding slowly. "We shall see how far your resolve truly goes, human. But know this, you are no longer just a diplomat. You are a challenger, a force to be reckoned with, and now you have my attention." Mark didn't know if that was a compliment or a threat, but he didn't care. He had made it through the first test, and he was one step closer to proving that humanity was stronger than the Ashar had ever realized. Mark's body ached with the aftereffects of the battle, the adrenaline still rushing through his bloodstream as he was led out of the arena, his limbs stiff and sore. The air in the corridors felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. His mind kept replaying the fight, the way the creature had moved with an unnatural fluidity, how it had felt when he struck it, the shock in his bones. He had never fought anything like that before, nothing that didn't follow the rules of nature, nothing that could take so much punishment and still keep coming. Nixera walked beside him, her gaze never leaving him, her silence deafening in its weight. Mark could feel the tension between them like an invisible thread, pulled tight, ready to snap at any moment. Her presence was overwhelming, like a storm cloud just waiting to burst, and he couldn't tell if she was angry, impressed, or something else entirely. He had learned not to try to read her too much. There were layers to her that he couldn't begin to understand yet. "You survived," she said finally, her voice soft and cool, but there was something else in it, something like recognition. "You have a strength that is rare among your kind." Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words felt hollow to him, like she was simply stating a fact. It didn't change what he needed to do. He couldn't afford to be distracted by her praise, or by whatever twisted game She was playing with him. He had to stay focused on the bigger picture. Humanity's future depended on him. They reached a chamber deeper within the ship, a place even colder than the rest of the vessel. The walls here were lined with strange markings glowing faintly with an eerie light, as if they were alive. Nyxera gestured for Mark to enter, and he did without a word, stepping into the dimly lit room, his eyes adjusting to the low light as his footfalls echoed off the stone floor. This room, Nyxera's voice was quieter now as she entered behind him, is where we keep our most important prisoners, the ones who have proven themselves worthy of attention, but not yet worthy of freedom. You will stay here until I decide what to do with you. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. The silence stretched between them as Nyxera moved toward the far wall, her fingers tracing the symbols carved into it. The glow seemed to respond to her touch, almost as if the ship itself were alive and reacting to her presence. You think you can change the course of history, Nyxera said, suddenly turning to face him, her gaze intense. But you are just one human. You cannot expect to change the tides of an empire with your empty words and stubbornness. Mark's pulse quickened, but he held her gaze steady. I'm not here to change an empire. I'm here to change the future. And that means we have to work together, not just survive in separate corners of the galaxy. Nyxera's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Work together. She repeated, how quaint and naive. You truly believe that I would work alongside your kind, even if you were to prove yourself worthy. Mark took a deep breath, resisting the urge to lash out at her arrogance. I believe it's possible, because I know what humanity is capable of, and I know you've seen it too deep down. You know, we're not like the other species you've conquered. For a long moment, Nyxera didn't say anything, her eyes studying him as though weighing his every word. The silence between them seemed to stretch forever before she spoke again, her tone almost softer now. You are a curious human, Lieutenant Reynolds, but curiosity alone will not win you peace. I didn't say it would, Mark replied, his voice calm. But I'll take whatever chances I can get, even if it means fighting to prove my people's worth. She regarded him with a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before finally nodding. You've proven something today, but it is only the beginning. We have many tests ahead, and the game is far from over. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could feel it in his gut, the tension between them, the pull towards something more than just this game of survival, something that went beyond their roles as enemies or pawns. He could feel the weight of it the same way he felt the weight of the galaxy itself pressing down on him. Nyxera turned, and with a final glance over her shoulder, she spoke, her voice cold again. Rest for now, human, but remember this: if you fail any of the tests to come, then all of your hopes for peace will crumble beneath the weight of your failure. Mark stood still, watching her leave the room, his mind already racing, preparing for the next challenge. Whatever it might be, he knew it would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the act of diplomacy. But he also knew this much: humanity wasn't going down without a fight, and he was ready to lead that fight, no matter what the cost. The next few days passed in a blur of pain and uncertainty. Mark was pushed to his limits with each new challenge Nyxera had set before him, each test growing more brutal, more personal than the last. He fought in the arenas with his bare hands against creatures that defied nature itself. He navigated mazes designed to break his mind and his spirit, each one more twisted than the last. And all the while Nyxera watched silently, her cold eyes never leaving him, her presence always just a step behind. The tests weren't just physical, they were psychological too, each trial designed to tear at the fabric of his resolve, to break him into something smaller, something weaker. But he refused to let it happen. He couldn't afford to let it happen. Humanity was watching, and if he failed here, then they would all lose their chance at peace. There were moments when doubt crept in, when he wondered if it was even possible to change the mind of someone like Nyxera, to make her see humanity not as an inferior race to be crushed, but as an equal to stand beside her. But then he would remember the faces of his people, the children, the families, the ones who had nothing to do with this war, and it would push him forward, even when his body screamed for rest, even when his mind begged for an escape. One morning, after yet another brutal sparring match, Mark was left alone in the holding room. He had come to dread this place. It was cold and barren, with nothing but the bare walls, and the flickering lights overhead. His muscles screamed in protest as he sank down to the floor, rubbing his temples in an attempt to ease the pounding headache that had been building for hours. He hadn't slept in what felt like days, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. His thoughts were cloudy, his reflexes slower than they should have been. He could feel himself slipping, and that scared him more than anything. He couldn't afford to slip. He had to stay sharp no matter what. The door opened with a soft hiss, and Mark looked up to find Nixara standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh light from the corridor. She stepped inside without a word, her presence filling the room like a storm cloud ready to break. "You look tired, human," she said, her voice low, but there was something almost sympathetic in it. "I expected more from you." Mark stood slowly, his legs shaky from the exertion of the last few days. "I'm not some machine, you know, Nixara. I'm human. We have limits." She stepped closer, her gaze unreadable as she looked him up and down. "I know what you are, Lieutenant Reynolds, and I know your limits better than you think. But this is not about you. This is about something much larger than you and your tired body." "I know that," Mark replied, his voice low but firm. "But you have to understand, this isn't just some game to us. We're not playing for sport or for power. We're playing for survival, for a future where we don't have to fight every second of every day." Nixara studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "I understand survival more than you think, human," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've seen what happens when species fail to adapt to the realities of the universe. It is not mercy that keeps the Ashar Empire strong. It is strength and ruthlessness." Mark's eyes narrowed. "I'm not asking you to show us mercy. I'm asking you to consider that there's another way to survive without destroying everything in your path." For the first time since he had arrived, Nixara seemed to pause, her expression flickering for just a moment, as though his words had struck something deep within her, something that she wasn't ready to confront yet. "The Ashar have survived for millennia without the need for weak alliances or peaceful coexistence," she said slowly. "We have learned that in the end, it is only power that matters and everything else is just fleeting." "And yet here you are," Mark said, his voice rising slightly, staring into the abyss, wondering if it's time for something different, because deep down you know that power isn't the answer, not forever. Nixara's eyes hardened, but there was something there now, a flicker of uncertainty beneath the surface. She stepped back and turned toward the door without saying another word, but before she left she glanced back over her shoulder, her eyes locking with his for a moment longer than necessary. "You are not like the others, human," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You are more persistent, more challenging than I expected, and for that you have earned my respect." Mark wasn't sure what to make of her words. They could have been a trap, or they could have been genuine, but either way he knew it wasn't over yet. Nixara's respect wasn't something he could rely on. He still had to prove himself to her and to the Empire, but for the first time since he had arrived, there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before, hope maybe, or the first signs that she was beginning to consider the possibility of peace. But it wasn't enough, not yet, and Mark knew that the real test was still ahead. The days blurred together after that moment with Nixara. Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind, even as the tests grew harsher, each one designed to push him further than he thought possible. The pain in his body was constant, now dull and aching like a persistent shadow that refused to leave his side, but it was the fatigue in his mind that truly began to take its toll. Every test seemed to be a battle not just against his body, but against his very willpower. They wanted him to break, they wanted him to beg for mercy, but Mark wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. The next trial came without warning. They didn't even give him time to prepare. Nixara simply appeared at the door, one morning, her eyes cold as ever, her gaze unreadable, but there was a flicker there, something behind her eyes that made him uneasy. "You will face your final test today, human," she said, her voice low and firm. "It will decide whether you live or die, whether your people ever have a chance at peace." Mark's stomach twisted at her words, but he forced himself to stand tall. "I've faced everything you've thrown at me so far, Nixara. I'm not going to back down now." She didn't respond. She only gestured for him to follow, and he did without hesitation. The corridors of the ship felt darker now, as though the very walls were closing in around him, his every step echoing in the silence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. They reached a large chamber at the heart of the ship, a place he had never seen before. The walls here were lined with black stone, and the air was thick with a strange energy Mark couldn't place. At the center of the room was a massive pillar of obsidian stone swirling with dark energy, like a black hole waiting to swallow him whole. The ground beneath his feet hummed with power, and Mark could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As he stepped closer to the pillar, something about it felt wrong, like it was calling to him, like it was alive. "This is the final test." Nyxora's voice cut through the silence. "You will enter the trial space and face your greatest fears, your deepest regrets, your most painful memories. You will be forced to confront everything that has made you weak, and you will either emerge stronger or you will break." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching as the gravity of her words settled on him. He had faced physical pain, mental strain, but this was something different. This was a test of his very soul, a test that would make him face all the things he had tried to bury deep inside himself. "I fought for survival every day of my life," he said, his voice steady despite the growing unease inside him. "I'm not afraid of some twisted illusion." Nyxora's lips curled into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We shall see, human. We shall see if your resolve is as strong as you claim." Before Mark could respond, Nyxora raised her hand, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The air around him seemed to ripple like water, and suddenly everything went dark. He was plunged into a cold darkness so complete it felt suffocating. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move his body, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of isolation and fear. But then a faint light appeared in the distance, and he forced himself to take a step forward. The ground beneath his feet was soft like sand, and as he moved closer to the light, he saw something that made his heart stop. It was the face of a child, a little girl no older than 5, standing in the middle of the darkness, her eyes wide and filled with terror. "Help me," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible, but it cut through him like a knife. Mark's breath caught in his throat, and he froze. The image of the girl staring at him, pulling at his very soul. The pain in her eyes mirrored the pain he had felt so many years ago, when he had lost his own sister during the early days of the war. The memories flooded back in an instant, the day she had died, the screams, the chaos, the helplessness that had haunted him every moment since. He reached out toward the girl, his hand trembling, but before he could touch her, she vanished into the darkness, leaving him alone once again with nothing but the crushing weight of his memories. A voice echoed in the darkness, Nyxora's voice, cold and unfeeling. "Do you see now, human? Do you see how weak you truly are?" Mark's chest tightened as he fought to push the memories away, but they were relentless. They came crashing over him like a tidal wave, every failure, every loss, every regret threatening to drown him in its depth. But as he stood there in the darkness, a spark of something deep inside him flared up. It was a fire, a spark of defiance, a refusal to give in. He had lost people, yes, but he had also gained something. He had gained strength, he had gained purpose, and he was not going to let his past define him. He took a deep breath, and the darkness began to shift around him, the weight of his memories easing slightly as he fought to regain control. The fear began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. He would not be broken, not by his past, not by Nyxora, and not by any test she could throw at him. The darkness began to recede as Mark's mind found a way to regain control, the image of the little girl fading into nothingness. Like a phantom, he forced himself to take another step forward. The ground beneath him was still soft and shifting, but his feet were steady now. He had faced the worst of it. His past no longer had the power to break him, but Nyxora's voice echoed through the air like a shadow that refused to leave. "You think you've conquered your fear, human," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But fear is not something you can simply outrun. It will always find you again when you least expect it." Mark clenched his fists and took another step forward, his breath coming steady. Now he refused to let her control him. Not anymore. This was his fight, not hers, and he would finish it on his terms. The air shifted again this time. He could feel the temperature drop sharply, his skin prickling with the sudden cold. He looked around, but there was nothing to see, just endless blackness stretching in every direction. It was as though the world itself had vanished, leaving him alone in the void. But then he heard something, a sound, a familiar sound, the crackling of fire and the faint smell of smoke. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned his head toward the source of the sound in the distance. He saw a flicker of orange light, a fire burning bright against the darkness. He moved toward it cautiously, his mind already racing with what it could mean. But as he drew closer, the scene before him froze him in his tracks. It was the wreckage of a ship, the very ship he had served on during the war, the one he had commanded his men on, the one that had been torn apart by an enemy ambush, a night that haunted him. Still the fire burned high and bright, the flames licking at the sky, the screams of his crew members still echoing in his ears. He saw their faces burned into his memory, each one of them a casualty of the war that had torn everything apart. He could hear their voices now calling out for help, begging for mercy, begging him to save them. But he couldn't move, he couldn't do anything except stand there frozen, watching it all unfold again, the horror, the helplessness, the guilt. "Is this what you wanted?" Nixera's voice was like a knife cutting through the pain. "To relive your failures over and over again." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the memories pressing down on him until it felt like he couldn't breathe. But something inside him snapped, a quiet fury building deep in his chest. He wouldn't let this moment define him. He wouldn't let this guilt be the last thing that defined his life. He took a step forward, then another, and another, until he was standing in the middle of the wreckage, his hands shaking, but his resolve firm. He could see the faces of his men now in the firelight, each one of them looking to him for answers, looking to him to make the impossible choice, to save them or to let them go. But he couldn't save them, not now, not in this place. The past was behind him, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The only thing that mattered was what came next, what he would do with the pain, the guilt, the memories he had to live with. "Enough," Mark said, his voice strong despite the tremor of emotion that ran through him. "I won't be your pawn, Nixera. I won't let you turn my past into my cage." The fire flickered and then went out, leaving him standing alone in the darkness once more. But this time it was different. The weight of his memories no longer pressed down on him as heavily as it had before. He had faced it. He had stood in the middle of it all and refused to let it destroy him. Nixera's presence lingered in the air around him, but it was no longer as suffocating as it had been before now. There was a quiet respect in the way she regarded him, a shift in the way she saw him. The trial was over, and Mark had passed it. But he knew that Nixera's game wasn't over yet. The true challenge was still to come. As the darkness began to fade, Mark stepped forward again, the solid ground beneath his feet grounding him in the present. He wasn't the man he had been when he first arrived on the Ashar flagship. He had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. He had faced his past and emerged stronger for it. And now there was nothing left to fear. The darkness faded entirely, leaving Mark standing alone in the center of the room, his breath steady now as the air around him seemed to shift, the weight of his past no longer hanging over him like a shadow. But even as the stillness settled in, Mark knew he wasn't done yet. Nixera's games had only just begun, and now he had to face whatever came next. The walls around him hummed with energy, a low vibrating sound that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground shifted beneath his feet, and the room transformed. The walls no longer smooth and unyielding, but jagged, now covered in alien symbols glowing faintly with an ominous light. The space stretched and twisted into something new, a battlefield. The ground beneath his feet cracked like broken glass, and in the distance he saw the silhouettes of soldiers, their forms indistinct, but their presence undeniable. Mark's stomach twisted. He recognized them before they even came into focus. They were his crew members, the ones who had died in the ambush, the ones he couldn't save. The faces burned into his memory, now standing before him, as if no time had passed at all. They were looking at him with the same eyes they had when they died, the same pleading expressions of trust they had placed in him as their commander. And then he heard it, the sound of gunfire, the screech of a missile cutting through the air, the crash of metal on metal, and the screams of his crew as the world around him erupted into chaos. It was happening all over again. "No," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible as he took a step backward. "Not again." But it was too late. The scene was unfolding once more, the same nightmare he had been reliving for years, now replaying with perfect clarity. Every moment, the terror, the helplessness, the guilt, it was all here again, every single detail of that night now surrounding him. "You cannot escape it, human." Nixara's voice echoed from every direction. "Your past will always follow you, no matter where you go. It is a part of you, a weakness that defines you." Mark clenched his fists, his heart hammering in his chest. But this time it was different. He wasn't going to give in again. Not to this, not to the same ghosts that had haunted him for so long. He wasn't the same man who had failed them that night. He had changed. He had faced his past and survived it. He had learned from it, and he would not let it control him any longer. He took a deep breath and shouted into the chaos, "I don't belong here anymore." The battlefield around him flickered like a glitch in a broken hologram, the scene shifting and distorting as the soldiers' faces blurred and faded, the gunfire turning into a soft hum, the screams melting into silence until everything was still again. Nixara's voice returned, but it was quieter now, almost a whisper. "You think you can change your fate, human, but it is already written. You will always be the same. You will always fail." Mark stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each steady breath, the weight of the battlefield still lingering in the air, but he refused to let it break him. "You're wrong, Nixara. My past doesn't define me, it doesn't control me, and it never will." The silence stretched between them, and for a moment there was nothing but the stillness of the room, as if the very universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. And then it did. The walls began to shift once more, the alien symbols on the stone surfaces flickering and dimming until they were gone entirely, the jagged edges of the room smoothing into something more familiar, something more human. The space began to brighten, as if the sun itself had risen over the horizon, and Mark felt the warmth of it flood through him, the ghosts of his past fading into nothingness as the light around him grew brighter. Nixara stood before him, now her expression unreadable as always, but her eyes held something different, a flicker of something resembling respect, or perhaps curiosity. "You have done what I thought impossible, human," she said, her voice low and steady. "You have faced your past and emerged from it stronger than I expected." Mark's gaze didn't falter. "I told you I'm not going to break. I'm not here to be your pawn or your trophy. I'm here to make peace, and I'll fight for that no matter what it takes." Nixara watched him for a long time, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing something deep inside her before she finally spoke again. "Perhaps there is something to your people after all, something worth considering, but understand this, human." She paused, and her voice grew colder. "The next step will not be as easy, and your survival here will not guarantee anything." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, Nixara. I've faced your worst, and I'm still standing." Nixara nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on him before she turned and began to walk away. "We will see if your resolve holds up when the real tests begin," she said without looking back. Mark stood there in the quiet aftermath of the trial, feeling this strange sense of clarity for the first time since he had arrived on this ship. He had faced his past and survived, but the future was still uncertain, and the trials ahead would be even more grueling than anything he had experienced so far. But as he walked toward the door to follow Nixara, his mind was clear, his heart steady, and he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let fear or guilt or anything else hold him back anymore. Humanity had a future, and he was going to fight for it with everything he had. The doors slid open with a hiss as Mark stepped into the corridor. Beyond, Nixara was already waiting for him, her back to him, as she stared out at the vast expanse of space visible through the ship's viewport, the stars glittering in the distance like a promise of things to come. But there was no joy in the view, no peace in the silence of the moment. Mark approached her slowly, his feet heavy but resolute. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of everything that had happened already pressing down on him. He had passed her trials, faced his demons, and emerged stronger than before, but he knew the true battle was only just beginning. "You did well, human," Nixara's voice cut through the silence, but there was no warmth in it, no admiration, just a quiet acknowledgement. "You survived my trials, and prove that you are more than the others I have tested." Mark didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. There was nothing to say, not yet, not until he understood what Nyxera truly wanted from him, the woman who had watched him break and rise again, the one who had held his future in her hands. She turned to face him, her eyes cold and unreadable, but there was something in them now, a flicker of something unfamiliar. "You have shown me that there is more to your species than I anticipated. You fight not just for survival, but for something deeper, for purpose, something that many of my own people have forgotten." Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. "I'm not fighting for something abstract, Nyxera. I'm fighting for my people, for every person out there who doesn't deserve to die because of this war, because of this cycle of violence and hatred that you and your empire have created." Her gaze hardened, but Mark didn't flinch. "You speak of peace, human," she said slowly, her words like a challenge. "But peace is a fragile thing. It is not easily won, and it is not something that is granted to the weak. It is something that must be taken and held through force." "I know what peace costs," Mark said, his jaw tightening. "But there's another way. We don't have to destroy everything in our path to survive. We can coexist. We can find a way to build something better, something stronger together." Nyxera regarded him in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable, as though she was weighing something deep inside herself. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and contemplative. "Perhaps your species is not as weak as I thought. Perhaps you have the potential to change the course of this war. But understand this, human," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There will be no peace without sacrifice, no end to the bloodshed without consequences, and you will have to fight for every inch of ground you gain." Mark's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. "I'm ready for that," he said with conviction. "I've already sacrificed more than I thought possible, and I'll keep fighting until the war is over, until we have a future worth living for." For a long time, Nyxera said nothing. She only studied him, her eyes flicking over his face, as if searching for something that she couldn't find. She seemed to make a decision, then her posture shifting as she stepped closer to him, until she was standing just a few feet away, her gaze still intense. "You have earned my respect, human," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "And because of that, I will give you a chance. I will allow you to present your case to the Azshar High Council, to argue for your people's survival, to make your case for peace." Mark's heart skipped a beat, the weight of her words settling on him like a heavy cloak. He had expected resistance from her, but this was more than he had hoped for. This was the opportunity he needed to change everything, to end the war and secure a future for humanity. He nodded once, his throat tight, but his resolve stronger than ever. "I won't let you down, Nyxera. I won't let anyone down." She stepped back then, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned away and walked toward the command bridge. "The council will not be an easy audience," she said over her shoulder, "but you have already proved that you are capable of handling what lies ahead." Mark watched her go, his mind racing as he took in what had just happened. He had done it. He had earned his shot at peace, and now all that was left was to convince the Azshar High Council that humanity deserved a chance to live on their own terms. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt the weight of hope settle over him. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something much greater, for peace, for a future where humanity wasn't just a casualty of war, but a partner in a shared destiny. He turned away from the viewport and headed toward the council chamber, his heart steady and his mind clear. Whatever happened next, he would face it head on and fight with everything. He had to ensure that humanity's place in the stars was secured once and for all.